It's about validating and authorizing us into history where we've been erased from histories and erased from participating in the present or even in the future.
I'm Kate Brown, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast from ArtNet News. Kent Monkman is one of the most vital and provocative voices in contemporary painting. Based between Toronto and New York, and a member of the Fisher River Cree Nation in Treaty 5 territory, Monkman is known for his epic genre-bending canvases that challenge dominant historical narratives and reframe them through Indigenous and queer perspectives. His work blends European painting traditions with Indigenous history to recontextualize colonialization and explore themes of resistance, joy, and identity. At the center of many of these works is Miss Chief Eagle Testicle, a time-traveling alter ego who acts as a provocateur and a force for reimagining the past. As his first major U.S. museum exhibition, called History is Painted by the Victors, opens at the Denver Art Museum, Monkman joined me to reflect on the road to this moment, a journey that has spanned decades. We spoke about how growing up in Winnipeg shaped his relationship to museums, how painting helps him process historical trauma, and the collaborative energy that fuels his studio practice. This is a conversation about painting, storytelling, and the power of reclaiming history. Hi, Ken. Thanks for joining me on The Art Angle today. Where am I finding you?
Today I'm in Toronto.
Yeah, so you're based between New York and Toronto, and you're in the final stages for preparing your first major U.S. museum exhibition, which opens at the Denver Art Museum, which will eventually come to Canada. How are you feeling ahead of this major opening moment?
Well, I'm really excited about this project. We started talking about this project with Denver Art Museum in 2018. So there was a pandemic in there. There were some stops and starts, but we stayed the course and we're ready to open this exhibition. It's really exciting because when you create a large body of work over a couple of decades, the individual works go into different collections. And then sometimes you don't see them for a really long time. So I'm excited to see some of these works that I haven't seen in a very long time and all together in one room. It's also an exciting project for me because often when I work with museums, I'm also wearing the curator's hat, working with a museum collection. In this case, it was a very different project. I just sort of let the curators take over. So I'm excited to see what they come up with. You know, I saw an early iteration of the 3D model, but since then, I've been kind of out of the project and I trust them. So I'm excited to see how it all comes together.
Fantastic. A certain kind of surrendering is always sort of liberating. I want to come to the changing context of your work. You know, you mentioned that this project began in 2018, which was a very different political situation than we're in now, but we'll come to that a bit later. To start, I wanted to talk about this unflinching consideration of the Western artistic canon that you encompass in your work from an Indigenous perspective. Your works use the formalities of Western art to render these overlooked narratives. And then, as you mentioned, in these museum contexts, they often exist in spaces that have historically excluded Indigenous voices or even been actively harmful to them. I'm curious, how did your experience growing up in Canada and the Canadian prairies shape your view of art and ultimately these institutions and galvanize you to want to work with them in this way?
Well, I've been an artist my entire life. So I was very young growing up in the city of Winnipeg and would go to the Winnipeg Art Gallery. I had access to Saturday morning art classes there. So from a very early age, I felt that in many ways I belonged there. And it was this idea that I could participate or at least go to museums and see what was in them. And it wasn't until much later in my 20s and 30s that I really started to unpack the art history that had been created, specifically the narratives told about Indigenous people by settlers and by settler artists that came here. So that came later, but early on I felt a sense of just wonder and curiosity about museums. Museums really became an important part of my career later when I decided to interrogate and challenge the narratives told by 19th century artists that were looking at Indigenous people and had their eyes on Indigenous lands.
What narratives being told about your culture were you shocked to learn about?
It wasn't so much shocking. It was just, I guess we were all so used to it already because of Westerns and, cowboys and Indians and like, the cowboy always wins and Tonto and the Lone Ranger, all of that in pop culture. And in many ways was just being sort of regurgitated in museums. Indigenous people are from this bygone era. And another museum in Winnipeg that we went to was a natural history museum. And inside the museum, there was a diorama that I was obsessed with that I even made artwork about later in life. It was a buffalo hunt. And I remember just going through that museum, obviously feeling very proud about my cultural heritage. And then stepping outside that museum onto Main Street in Winnipeg was kind of a shock for my classmates because there were Indigenous people like tumbling out of bars drunk in the middle of the day. And I had no way to reconcile what we saw in the museum as being this very beautiful romantic image of our cultures frozen in time. And then the fallout of Colonial project right there in front of them. And I didn't have the wherewithal or the knowledge as a school-age kid to reconcile that to them. That's something that's been driving me as an adult, is to bring them to that knowledge, to reconcile that difference, that gap between what's in the museum and what happened. And that's why so much of my work is about the Colonial project, because of the decimation and the intergenerational impact that it's had on our communities. And that certainly drives so much of my work, is that urgency to communicate to people or continuing to deal with these traumas, and also how we are healing and how incredibly resilient we are to have not just survived, but to be thriving despite some of these difficult histories. But that experience of coming out of a museum and just having my classmates look at me and saying, "What happened to you?" That was quite a profound thing that I remembered and certainly was able to respond to later as an artist.
So you revisit a lot of historical artworks, whether they're Rubens, Rembrandts, or Picasso's. And you also reference some works that are less well known, like this very disturbing painting, Throwing Sodomites to the Dogs, which you made based on Theodore de Brye's 1594 engraving called Balboa Throwing Indian Sodomites to the Dogs. In broad strokes, your work challenges these orthodoxies of modernism, of Western art history, of the idea of like minimalism as some sort of pure thing, and of course, the legacy of old masters. Is this emerging from a critical and contemptuous relationship only, or is there also an homage, even if it is transgressing that legacy?
There's absolutely an homage, particularly to French Romanticism and Spanish history painting. I was an abstract painter probably for the first 12 or 15 years out of art college, and I was obsessed with this idea that painters had to find their own individual mark if they were to really establish their own unique way of making work. And so I set about doing that and eventually achieved that. And then I realized that my own personal language was so cryptic that my audience was outside the work. And then I realized that really what I wanted to do was communicate. There was an urgency to the themes and the subjects that I wanted to communicate about. And those had to do with the fallout of the Colonial project. This sort of personal, cryptic, abstract language was leaving my audience so far outside the work that they found them beautiful or puzzled over them. And then I was also kind of mortified that people would buy my work just because they thought it was beautiful or it would match their couch. And to me, that was sort of a turning point to really look at the colonial art history and to see where it had erased Indigenous narratives or just overlooked them or didn't understand them. As I started to work more with museums, I also realized that they were perpetuating these same misunderstandings and underestimations of who we are as Indigenous people. So the working with museums and the work of these individual artists became kind of a tandem project in addressing both of those different practices. It really opened a very wide terrain for me to explore.
Your work has obviously evolved over the decades. And on your website, there's a line drawn between 2001 and 2019, and then 2020 to the present. Do you work in cycles? Could you explain a bit your most recent bodies of work and what you're trying to dive into these days?
I often will keep working one series over a long period of time, but I'll have several series going at any given time. And some of these series are such fertile areas of exploration that a group of 8 or 10 paintings might not be enough to fully explore it. So I just kind of keep them going. And it also provides a really kind of interesting balance of work that we create in the studio. Some subjects are harder hitting, others are more fun and playful. So when we're going between different series, it also kind of provides us a balance of different subject matter that we work with. But my methodology as an artist really evolved over time, and it really started to shift once I started to work with assistants, because I had to find a way to communicate and to teach a very specific kind of painting. It was the kind of painting that I had developed on my own after many years of learning from pushing paint around as an abstract painter. I mean, I learned so much about paint, the qualities of paint, what paint could do in terms of color and transparency. All the foundational formal elements of painting I learned in those years of pushing paint around. And all of that came to bear when I took on this greater challenge of then relinquishing that idea of having my hand be recognized and to kind of surrender and disappear my hand into the work. And that's when I really started to look more carefully at the old masters, particularly artists like Delacroix, who was obsessed with Rubens. And, old masters would make copies of their favorite paintings. But I realized that no matter how hard you tried, I could never make my hand look like Delacroix or Rubens. And I think that was a maturing as an artist that I kind of liken it to, a great orchestral piece or a masterful film. The director or the conductor, the composer, really, they bring all of the elements together and you're not aware of one element more than another. And that was really what I understood that these great history paintings were capable of doing. You weren't taken at first with the brush stroke or one of those formal elements. You kind of took in the overall picture and what the painting was communicating on different levels. And that's really what I wanted to do with my own work of art, was to surrender that individual, very obvious wiggle, as I call it, and then bring all of these elements together like a beautiful symphony and have them work in relation to each other so that the overall impact of the story, you could use all of those elements to really heighten the emotional impact, the historical impact, all the different things that are possible with this very sophisticated language of painting. So I was never interested in diminishing it. I always was in awe of painters that could do that. And so I set about doing that in my own studio, and that was a challenge. It's actually much harder. People think, oh, you work with assistants, you don't make your own work. It's so much harder to bring a team together and to train everybody to work on a painting together where we don't see one artist's hand take over another artist's hand. And that methodology that I polished over years of working with my incredibly talented team was to really start with the base of drawing. That's the most pure form of ideation for me. I'll have an idea in my head and I'll get it on paper as a drawing. And that drawing functions first to communicate to my team what we're going to strive towards creating. I started working with models and doing photo shoots in my own studio as a way to get better source material for my younger artists that I was working with. There was a time when I would take that drawing and I would turn it into a color study, again, right out of my own head, and then to the larger canvas. But the younger artists would not have as much experience, and so they would need that information to take it from drawing to study to the final version. So we started to develop a process of bringing models in, costuming them, and also working with digital photography and lighting. And we were able to get our own source material for many of our subjects, our models, and then those photo assets would be reconstituted digitally. We could take our time, play around with composition, resizing everything. And all of this can take months before we actually get on the canvas. We'll have the drawing, photo shoot, and we finally get to the canvas. And then a study is created. And even after the study is created, then we will make more modifications and alter things. And then we create the next size study and so on and so forth before we get to our final version. So it's a long process that can take sometimes years to finish a painting. And because we work on several, might be a couple of dozen works of art underway here at any given time, it allows us time to reflect, to think about it. It's all problem solving. And I will sometimes take paintings to my studio in the country and I'll figure something out and I'll bring it back and I'll share this new learning that I discovered with the team. It's like, okay, this is the technique that we're going to use to try to paint a certain kind of plant or a tree or something that will evolve in the practice. So it's constantly evolving. And I've created an atmosphere of generosity with my painting assistants where we share all of this knowledge and we don't just have a specialist who is assigned to only doing, for instance, trees or fabric or something. We really try to train everyone to have all of those well-rounded skills as a painter so we can kind of cycle painters around on different works. I'm constantly in touch with the works from beginning to end. And there are moments where the team will just stop working and then I have to come in and make some decisions and figure things out. And then we move forward. But it's really an atmosphere of experimentation and generosity and collaboration. And that results, I think, in some pretty amazing results in the work.
Certainly, yeah. These works have so much complexity and movement and action built into them in multiple levels and layers. They encompass so many different stories all at once. And I've also read that this is like borrowing from that quote unquote atelier method of working where you paint from live models, which is also, I can imagine, a sort of transgression of the Western tradition as well. You know, we've talked about your artist assistant. How do you create safe spaces for your models in these contexts? These are very charged scenes, sometimes depicting brutal acts of violence. They must carry a lot of emotional weight for the sitters to see themselves in it at a later point.
So when we cast our models, we're able to communicate with them exactly what they'll be participating in. And if we bring in, say, Caucasian models that are going to be playing cops, we choose them carefully. Again, it's about creating a playful, generous environment where people know they are acting, essentially. And we turn these experiences into a kind of play. We'll improvise scenes, and we end up actually having a lot of fun with these photo shoots. I think it's just about setting the tone and casting people carefully so we know that they all feel safe in these environments. We've done photo shoots with children. We brought some Indigenous children in with their families recently, and the children were thrilled to be in a photo shoot with other Indigenous children. Again, we sort of turned it into a playful experience for the children. That's really at the core of the practice, is that art making should be joyful, should be playful. We find a way to make it fun at different stages. That's one of the things I'm very proud of, is that the team that I've built here, there's a positive environment here. We do critiques twice a week and we encourage feedback from everybody. There's so much sharing in terms of knowledge that goes between the painters and our collaborators. It's really a wonderful environment to come into work.
Speaking of the casting calls, which I know you have put out on social media, you have a strong social media presence. And in instances, some of your paintings have gone viral and entered the news cycle themselves, which is interesting because some of the most current work also speaks to the news cycle, violence against the water protectors, for example. How do you think about your paintings circulating online? And do you grapple with them moving outside of their original contexts?
As an artist, you have an intention with an image, obviously, and you put it out there. But then beyond that, you can't really control how people will interpret that image. And so I'm mindful of it when we post on social media, but I think I have a very sophisticated audience, I would say. I don't like to underestimate how people are capable of reading images. Yes, you will have some people who will misinterpret things, and I can't control that, but the message in the work is ultimately something I think about a lot, is shifting people's perceptions, trying to provoke, to dislodge beliefs that are harmful for Indigenous people, that are held quite widely in dominant society. And we've been marginalized from art history, we've been dispossessed from our land. So many of these experiences are really what inform my work. So I know that my experience is something that is common to many people in my community. And I think a lot about my community as I make my work, because I'm always trying to uphold them and to spotlight many of the incredible people that are either artists or activists, leaders, teachers, doing incredible things in my community. So I'm always thinking about how this work might open a door or shift perception about who we are generally.
These paintings also ask the settler colonial public to be a witness to these overlooked histories. And, that creates an amount of discomfort. You read about it in reviews of your work. And I think at moments outrage, because these are images that have been hidden from a lot of the dominant narratives. I'm curious how you consider that effect. And if you see that audience is changing and evolving over time in a way that makes you optimistic.
I think there is an evolution to the audience because as people learn, they become more aware of these truths, the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And there's been such incredible erasure of Indigenous narratives in the education system, through government policies, through the colonial project with things like the residential schools or boarding schools in the US, loss of language. So as people learn and as the truth is uncovered, it gives people opportunities to educate themselves. That's really at the core of my work, is to get this message, the message of Indigenous experience, both historical and contemporary experience, out there as widely as possible. And some of these experiences are difficult experiences to look at, but they are the truth. And the colonial governments were trying to erase the past, and they were trying to remove Indigenous people from our lands and to remove us from society in general. So they wanted to assimilate Indigenous people and destroy cultures and languages. So it's really important for people to understand that we're still here. We've always been here and we will always be here.
I'd love to consider some of these works, in particular, The Scream from 2017, which is on view in Denver, and I believe was acquired by the museum. It is a searing example of what you were just speaking about. It depicts children being taken from their homes and ripped from their mother's arms by the Canadian Royal Mounted Police and members of the church. It's a historical painting, truly, because this occurred from the 1880s right up until the 1990s in Canada through these government-mandated assimilation efforts. Maybe you can walk us through how you conceived of a piece like this in particular. Also, how do you manage your own emotional process through the painting process? How is it a way to process this yourself?
Art making, first of all, gives you a way out. I like to talk about it as I'm presenting a truth like this. I make a painting that is exciting to look at, that is eye-catching, that is compositionally well achieved. It gives an audience a way in. And art making for me is a way to transcend. It's a way for me to process difficult truths. And I always make these images for myself first. I know that some of these images will resonate with an audience or with other people, but it's about validating and authorizing us into history where we've been erased from histories and erased from participating in the present or even in the future. And so I think about how to captivate an audience, to give them a way in, but also a way out. The way out is how art can achieve that way out through creating something beautiful. You can create a work of art that will also give you hope. It'll give you a way to sort of see the way forward. That's how it functions for me, that when I create difficult things like this, there's a way out for me as well.
I want to come to speaking about your alter ego, Miss Chief Eagle Testicle, in a moment, because she also represents this kind of way out and is a figure of hope that reoccurs in your paintings. But just before that, as you're speaking about this way out, I also want to touch on some more recent paintings where you've started to render queer settler figures. And they also appear to me as being partially emancipated from the patriarchal narrative in particular. Could you speak a bit about this sort of cycle of work?
Again, it's this obvious truth that's been there throughout all of history. There have always been queer people, and at different moments in time, there are policies or religions that try to suppress what has always been there. And so when I look through history on this continent, there's evidence of all kinds of queer people that existed in settler societies at the same time that they were discovering that in Indigenous societies, we had a place for non-binary people, what we refer to now as two-spirit people. And it's a way to just make this relationship that human sexuality in all of its different forms has always been there, as long as we've been here as human beings on this planet. When societies suppress sexualities like this, it's really to serve other purposes, which have to do with power and control and usually money. I like to remind people of their own queer histories and how there were times where it really wasn't a big deal. I keep looking to my own culture and specifically Indigenous cultures on this continent. And that was really the inspiration for Mischief, was that I would create a character that really embodied a more positive, accepting way of considering non-binary people or queer people. And that certainly existed in Indigenous societies throughout North America.
I'd love to speak a bit more about Mischief, which is a play on mischief. She's this time-traveling trickster who disrupts these colonial narratives, and she's often, or always, donning these red-soled stilettos. She's often gazing out at the viewer and breaking the fourth wall and really looking at you amidst a scene. Can you talk about the origins of this? Because my understanding is she connects to Cree storytelling in particular.
Well, when I first created her, the inspiration came from the work of some settler artists like George Catlin and others who were looking at Indigenous subjects, and Catlin would paint himself painting Indigenous people. So by inserting himself in the painting as the viewer, I wanted to create a persona that could live in my work and reverse the gaze. So she really became about exploring the ego of the artist. You know, Catlin was also a showman and did a lot of self-promotion. And so I thought I would play with that and create a character that could live inside my work, but reverse the gaze, look back at the settler as subject, and play with the power dynamics of artist and model. So the idea that Mischief really became a viewer. She also became a character with agency to tell stories. With my longtime collaborator and writing partner, Giselle Gordon, when we wrote Mischief's memoirs, which actually started 7 years ago, we set about really researching, and we wanted to situate her firmly into Cree worldview. And that meant understanding her origin story, writing her origin story, and understanding her purpose and how she fit into Cree cosmology. So we decided to work with 4 knowledge keepers: Keith Goulet, Gail Maurice, Belinda Daniels, and Floyd Favel, who are all Cree language speakers, to really firmly place her in a Cree worldview, really using the Cree language to help understand the character and how she related to the other legendary beings, like our trickster character, thunder beings, the mistikôsiwak, the little people. Through that exercise in writing the memoir, we also had to think about what her purpose was. And in doing that, we realized that she really functioned as a witness, and as a witness specifically for the colonial period.
And sometimes she's engaging in the scene in a potentially polemical way. And in particular, I'm thinking of a work that is also in the exhibition in the Denver Art Museum. It entered the news cycle as well, Hanky Panky, which is a scene where Mischief is holding up this red-handed, I believe it's a butt plug, and the former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is bent over, and she's surrounded by these laughing Indigenous women. And I'm curious how this painting came into being, which, you know, I know that you have spoken about and addressed, but also you mentioned earlier that it's going to be an interesting process to revisit these works years on. And I'm curious how this work has evolved for you in your thinking over the years.
The work hasn't really evolved for me. It still remains pretty much the same as when I created it. What changed for me was maybe how people reacted to that painting. It was obviously intended to be an allegorical painting about the judicial system, and it was commissioned as such. It was about the disproportionate numbers of Indigenous people that have been put into the welfare state, that have been put into prison. And it was reversing victim and victimizer and making a statement about that, obviously with a ludicrous image that people read literally because of the style of the painting. I mean, it was maybe too much for people to comprehend, but I think that also reinforced the power of art, the power of a painting, specifically this kind of work that can shock people and ask difficult questions. It was a learning for me specifically about how the work was released on social media. I think my biggest learning was more about social media and how to take care of the collaborators. I apologize to the collaborators on social media because they were being harmed. And I didn't see that coming, that the people who entrusted me with their image as models would be attacked on social media. And that's what I apologize for, was the harm that they were experiencing. But every single person that collaborated with me stood by the image and stood by me as an artist. And I was so grateful for the solidarity. There were mixed opinions out there within my own community. People were upset by the image. I totally get it. But I had an intention to create an image to shock people about the violence being perpetrated against Indigenous people. And it certainly went a little differently than I thought maybe it would. I couldn't have seen that coming, but it was also a great learning for me as an artist, and I wouldn't change anything.
Was there any reaction from an official level? I'm curious.
No, there was nothing that I think, we thought maybe there would be some sort of a statement from the Prime Minister's office or something, but they understood it to be art and they just let it be art. I had some defenders who made some statements for me publicly, specifically Senator Murray Sinclair, who said, it is agreed, it is a disturbing image, but he understood that I had flipped the victim and victimizer to create this kind of shocking impact.
Now, of course, the political sphere has changed yet again, and these paintings will exist in the US at a time that is particularly politically turbulent. I was thinking a lot has changed since your 2019 commission at the Met, which was on in 2020 during the uprising against the murder of George Floyd. It was really a time of profound reckoning in the US and around the world about injustices that overlap with a lot of the work that you do. And so now your exhibition is opening yet again during a Trump presidency, but this is a time where museums feel especially vulnerable, or are especially vulnerable, and where paintings like yours may fall into a different kind of narrative at the official level and also with the public. I wonder how you've been thinking through that, especially on the eve of this opening.
Well, who knows how or if this will fall on the radar of an administration that is set on rolling back some of the progressive movement that's happening in society for human rights. I don't know. We'll have to wait and see what happens. Like I said before, as Indigenous people, we've always been here, we will always be here, and we're always going to be saying the same things. And if we have to go back into education mode, well, we're always in education mode, but if we have to crank it up again, that's what we're going to do. We have been fighting a form of erasure since the colonial period. This is another opportunity to have our voices heard, to keep doing what we're doing, and to keep reinforcing our values. I always come back to our values, and myself as a Cree person, I think about the values that I've been taught and the things that we prioritize in our community. And so I think this is just an opportunity to educate people. I'm very fortunate to have the platform of a major US museum who understands and appreciates Indigenous art. They've been collecting Indigenous art as contemporary art for over 100 years. This is a museum that really privileges Indigenous ways of thinking. And so I'm very, very happy to have the opportunity to bring this perspective, my perspective, forward, and to also spotlight many of the incredible people that are in my community.
And this exhibition will also tour to Canada, as I mentioned earlier, to the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts in the fall. Just as a last question, because I do think it's important to distinguish, how do the audiences in Canada differ from those in the United States when engaging with your work? Are you thinking about these two exhibitions slightly differently, given the different cultural landscapes and their relationships to their own colonial history?
Well, right now, there's probably a greater difference in terms of the two administrations. But, these administrations change every 4 years. I really don't think too much about what happens every 4 years, again, because we've always been here and we will always be here. I don't change my tune every 4 years because there's a new administration and new policies. There are differences in terms of how the US and maybe some of their museums have created space for Indigenous art in their museums. I sometimes like to think that the US was, maybe a generation behind Canada in terms of reckoning with their Indigenous history. We might have a setback under the current administration, but I'm set on continuing to do the work that I do. And with the many museums that I'm in contact with in the United States, there are so many curious and intelligent and generous people that want to receive these narratives and are looking for the truth. And so I'm encouraged by the movement that's happening with Indigenous contemporary art on the upswing. It's exciting to see this interest in recent couple of years. I've been part of this art making community professionally for the last 4 decades. So it's really awesome to see that the United States and the museum community is finding a place to put Indigenous voices at the center of some of their museum exhibitions.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much, Kent. I really appreciate your time today, and I'm looking forward to seeing the exhibition.
Thank you so much.
That's it for this week's episode. If you like what you heard, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Also, take a moment to rate and review us. It will help other listeners discover what we're doing. The Art Angle is produced by Sonia Manalili with contributions from myself, Ben Davis, Carolyn Goldstein, and Naomi Ray. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.